Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are advised that the following program may contain images and voices of people who have died. This episode contains references to racism and suicide. We've come a long way since the 1970s, with double the number of women working. But one area we haven't seen change is the way businesses still treat men as breadwinners. An American study found that men who ask for flexible work are twice as likely to have their leave refused compared to women. And in Australia, this discrimination is actually legal.
The 1984 Sex Discrimination Act actually has a carve-out where it says you cannot be prosecuted for discriminating against men in the area of childbirth, pregnancy, breastfeeding and industrial policy basically around the birth of children.
So when it comes to opposite-sex couples, mums end up doing the bulk of parenting. Since 1950, women's magazine New Idea has run a column called Mere Male, where they publish hundreds of stories about supposedly dumb dads. Proof that fatherhood mightn't be their forte.
Often dads see themselves in a new light when the baby comes into the world. So fathers realise that, or they perceive that mothers are getting better at being mums faster than they're getting better at being dads.
But the reason why isn't biological.
In the same way we don't socialise women to be confident in workplaces, we don't socialise men to be confident as parents or carers.
In the past decade, less than 1% of workers granted parental leave were men. But most Australians believe that taking time off work is the responsibility of either or both parents. So if we no longer think of child rearing as women's work, how come nothing's changed about who does it?
The system is stacked against women.
Fear of destitution was the number one reason.
What should a woman be digging for? Poverty?
The expectations on women.
Gender-based commentary actually has a very chilling effect on women's confidence.
We sell our young women short.
The way we live has a lot to do with the parenthood gap. Traditionally, Aboriginal families live in multi-generational homes.
Sometimes when the mum is pregnant with the baby and she's still living at home, she'll have that baby and continue living with the parents. They like to stay close to their own mob.
Today, intergenerational living is on the rise across Australia. But the nuclear family structure, which was brought over by the British, still dominates. And a lot of responsibility falls on just two people's shoulders. The story starts in the early 1900s, when being a stay-at-home mum was enforced by the marriage bar to stop women from stealing men's jobs. The bill required all women to quit work once they got married, but Aboriginal women fared even worse, with their property and wages stolen, and the stolen generation still ongoing.
The dispossession of Aboriginal people took away their land and their livelihood, and today there are people who are incredibly wealthy because of that land base. None of those people are Aboriginal.
In 1966, the marriage bar was lifted, women's liberation kicked off, and in 1973, the landmark Maternity Leave Act entitled women in public service to 12 weeks of paid time off after childbirth. Since then, paid parental leave has increased to 18 weeks, but this is still far less than the average of 53 weeks in OECD countries. In 1983, superannuation principles were introduced before becoming mandatory in 1992.
However, little thought was given to how superannuation system linked to your salary is going to benefit the 40% of women that aren't currently working, or the almost 50% of women that earn less than $34,000.
Then, in 1984, Section 31 of the Sex Discrimination Act explicitly permitted employers to treat mothers and fathers differently.
I totally understand why that provision was there. You've got to remember what the Sex Discrimination Act was. It was an attempt in the 80s, when women were still kind of fairly new in great numbers in the workplace, to stem this tide of anti-woman behaviour that was in the workplace.
But as attitudes about gender kept changing, This piece of legislation came back to bite couples, wanting to split parenting 50-50. As recently as 2018, the Industrial Relations Commission has ruled against men requesting flexible work hours in the hope of sharing school pickups with their partners. And of the Australian employers with a flexible working policy, just 2% of these explicitly include men. But business isn't the only sector that forgot to factor in fathers.
Interestingly, there's actually no standardised training for midwives around engaging the father effectively. The experience is subject to a passionate midwife who actually believes in engaging the fathers during that antenatal class.
And fathers aren't the only parents failed by parts of the health system that are stuck in the past.
There continues to be negative stereotyping around Aboriginal parenting, and motherhood in particular is still very negative.
The fact that parents are treated differently because of their gender or culture doesn't just drive the pay gap. It also drives a wedge between families. To find out why, let's look at what happens when an opposite-sex couple has their first child. One of the first decisions that mum and dad have to make is who's going to take time off from work to look after the baby. Usually, that person ends up being mum, not dad. Because in the unlikely circumstance that dad's boss grants him long-term parental leave, the gender pay gap means that dad probably makes more money than his partner. So it makes sense for him to keep working. This means that mum will bond faster with their baby, which might make dad feel left behind.
So whilst dad thinks that mum is getting, she's really good at being a mum, most often mums don't feel that at all.
For me, when I first became a mum, I found the experience incredibly isolating.
But mum is more likely to seek support from friends or to join a mother's group, while dad struggles finding someone to talk to.
Men of my age group had more difficulty because they hadn't been the kith and kin keepers.
When fathers have a baby, work suffers, their social connections suffer, and they become really isolated.
So dad starts to spend more time at the office, where he'll be rewarded for hard work and for being a man.
Men get paid more over the course of their lifetime if they're dads. Now, why is that? Men with children are considered more employable, more stable, more promotable.
Dads can sometimes find validation in what they're good at, and they'll seek to do more of that. So if that's at work, then that's at work.
They've calculated that over an average 40-year career, he could expect to earn $2 million. Now, if he has kids, that goes up to $2.5 million.
But new dads aren't the only parents at risk of disconnection from friends and family. On average, an Aboriginal mum will have her first kid 5 years earlier than other women, which increases her risk of social isolation.
Some of them very young mothers, like at 18 or even 17, were diagnosed with depression and were on antidepressants, and I thought it might have only been loneliness.
And this adds to the stigma she already deals with.
But it's often deemed that a child's neglected if they spend one night at mum's, one night at aunt's, and then the next night at grandmother's, as opposed to understanding the communal nature of the way Aboriginal children are raised.
There's also not much consideration given to the way current systems penalise working women. When mum goes on paid parental leave, her employer is allowed to stop superannuation contributions. And by the time she wants to work again, there'll be new financial roadblocks.
The average Australian woman's salary peaks around age 31, just after the average age that an Australian woman has her first baby.
Australia has one of the most expensive childcare systems in the OECD, with families forking up to 30% of their household income just to cover costs.
So the combination of low parental leave and inadequate childcare means that the only way women can do that is to work part-time.
So, while the number of women in Australia's workforce has grown in half a century, women's full-time employment rate has remained almost the same since the 1970s. So, how does all of this affect families in the long run? The short answer is, everyone loses. Mums lose, dads lose, and their kids lose too. But let's just start with mum. She's the one who's most likely to lose her financial independence.
The promotions and career advancement that she misses out on during those times of being at home or in and out of the workforce will reshape her career.
In fact, Mum could lose her independence altogether, because when you add up her paid work commitments with all of the childcare and housework she does...
Women actually work on average an hour more than men each week. It's just that women are twice as likely to work in unpaid work.
With the total unpaid economy estimated to be over $500 billion, or a third of formal GDP.
That plays out in adulthood in a very particular and I think damaging way, which is we tend to put ourselves last. I'm not a good mother, I'm not a good worker, unless I am feeling good, that I am well slept, that I've looked after my mental health.
And the pressure placed on Dad to be the breadwinner has an impact on his mental health as well.
We end up with higher rates of suicide amongst boys and men. So these gender constructs are not good for boys and men either.
And all this time at work is to the detriment of Dad's relationship with his kids.
On day one, if you spend just 1 minute skin to skin with your child, it's most likely worth more than a whole week spent with your child when they're 15 years old. So if you don't do that day one, then you'll have a lot more work to do on your relationship later on.
You make your impact through your family and the people around you. So I think we need to be careful about not framing this debate as loss and more about opportunities for everyone to be a full human being.
Kids neglected by Dad or separated from family are prone to anger later in life, which makes the cycle hard to break.
The Indigenous community thinks very deeply about intergenerational trauma, particularly in the space around child removal and the legacy of the stolen generations. That means that there is an intergenerational level of poverty and an intergenerational level of a lack of financial literacy.
And all of this means that Aboriginal mums are more likely to have their kids taken away, which is also because Australia's outdated parenting policies leave gender and wealth gaps. So, how can we leave them behind and find a new normal? In southeast Sydney, the Royal Hospital for Women's Malabar Midwifery program creates a safer space for Aboriginal mums, both before and after childbirth.
We're definitely more judged, as parents. People stereotype Aboriginal people as not being able to look after their kids. Malabar midwives helped me a lot. Having someone, Aboriginal people just in general at the hospital creates a culturally safe environment.
Which is why Demi decided to be a nurse herself.
And that was my aim, that was my goal when I went to uni, was to do that, be a nurse for my community and for all Aboriginal people.
In Queensland, Tom Docking is working to fill another gap, one for fathers in the pre- and post-natal care spaces.
That looks like Dad's group appearing before them in the antenatal class, whether it be physically, face-to-face, or through a Zoom connection, and getting the fathers to connect with the other fathers in the room.
While Australia is behind other countries when it comes to parental leave, change in this area is only one of many steps that needs to take place.
Scandinavia have a really significantly advanced approach to supporting fathers, which is fantastic. But when you actually do scratch the surface, you soon see that the big gap is still that new fathers will literally just push a pram around for 3 years and then at the end of it say it was a really isolating time.
In Australia, 3 out of 4 people who take their own lives are men, which is why groups for dads are so important, and not just for dad's mental health.
So the flow-on effects for mum in a positive or in an ideal outcome is that mum feels supported and she also feels that her work is acknowledged and that their work is one that they decide together intentionally.
But in female same-sex relationships, gender norms about who raises the kids and who goes to work aren't really an issue to start with. In Sydney's inner west, Jess and Byrne have a blended family. They both work full-time and share their family responsibilities equally, but this wasn't always the case for Jess.
Having been with a male partner and had my children with a male partner, for me it was a struggle because his work was considered much more important than mine.
But the expectation that Jess would be the primary carer for her children changed once she entered a same-sex relationship.
When I decided to take on a leadership role at school, I knew I could because we were together at that point, and I knew I could because the lion's share of the work wasn't going to be with me. We would share the load.
And this is a pretty common difference between mums with an opposite-sex partner compared to mums in same-sex relationships. The ABS reports that women in same-sex relationships are 18% more likely to share household chores equally. And in 2018, a collaborative study between Norway and the USA found that the income of mothers in an opposite-sex relationship drops by 20% following the birth of their child. On the other hand, birth mothers in same-sex relationships only lose 13% of their income. So, how do they do it?
Generally speaking, dad might take out the rubbish while mum's, washing the dishes. And for us, obviously it's not gendered, it's about our strengths.
Yeah, my bugbear is, so who's the father in the relationship?
Who's the male, yeah.
There's no father, there's no male, there's two women.
There is no male in a female same-sex relationship, so gender norms apply differently. Same-sex mums are more likely to have active discussions about who cares for the kids and who goes to work, and to share these responsibilities more equally. Up to 4 years after paid parental leave has ended, same-sex mums are still working reduced hours. And while this means less income in the short term, longer term this allows both mums to work full-time.
Studies have shown that women tend to set themselves a long-term goal and slowly contribute money to get there.
All of this means that 5 years after having a baby, the total income of an opposite-sex household is down by up to 8%, compared to a same-sex household where the income has fully recovered. So, even though Australia needs policy changes to stop men being denied flexible work, splitting the loss of income across both parents after childbirth is one way that opposite-sex couples could see mum return to full-time work faster, have a higher household income in the future, and contribute to closing the gender pay gap. But when it comes to parenthood, there's no right or wrong way. What's important is that women have a choice to take on the role of primary carer because they want to, not because they have to.
It's taming women to be in the position that we want them to be in. It's making women small and tamed.
Yeah.
Still, mums who leave the workforce to care full-time will have less career opportunities and less money than those who don't. And dads who spend more time working than they do with their kids might regret it later. And all of this puts women at greater risk of financial vulnerability later in life. So, what can women do to secure their financial independence?